Welcome to episode 2 of Hopeful Fridays, our weekly look at sustainability success stories. Today we're going to be looking at 2 examples of sustainable fishing and how we can use no fishing zones in order to encourage biodiversity. So let's go ahead and get started. The first example we're going to look at is Baja California, which is a peninsula off the west coast of America and Mexico, and that forms the Gulf of California. For hundreds of years, local fishermen fished in the Gulf of California as their livelihood, but during the 20th century, external boats, fishermen from outside the area, and an increase in local fishermen decimated the fish stocks, and it ended up where towards the end of the 20th century local fishermen were actually struggling to make their livelihood because the fish stocks were so low. In 1998, this led to the decision by the local government to create no fishing zones, where local fishermen and external fishermen were banned from catching any fish in those areas. Now, there was a lot of concern about this at the time, given that the local fishermen were already struggling to catch enough fish to give them their livelihood. So the local government actually paid a subsidy to help the local fishermen buy their local groceries and support their families. And they recalled that the first 10 years or so were actually very challenging. But after that 10 years, they started to notice significant increases in the amount of fish that they were catching. By having these no fishing zones, it allowed the fish and allowed the other organisms in that ecosystem to survive and reproduce. It allowed them to have a safe habitat. And so the coral reefs started to regenerate. Smaller fish started to come back. Plankton started to come back to the area. And eventually these no fishing zones were teeming with life and teeming with biodiversity. And this had some knock-on effect that the fish populations would then spill over into the areas where the fishermen were allowed to catch fish. And this is what led to the increase in the number of fish that the fishermen were able to catch. The local government also protected the mangrove forests that grow on the edge of the coast. And they realised that areas of the coast that had a greater concentration of these mangrove forests, the fishermen who caught their fish there actually had a greater yield, a greater catch compared to areas where there weren't as much mangrove forests. And again, it's this idea of biodiversity within the mangroves spilled over into the waters where the fishermen were able to catch their fish. These no fishing zones had the added benefit of boosting the tourism economy that was in the California area, because now tourists were paying to go and see all the wonderful biodiversity that the no fishing zones created because of these amazing coral reefs, and turtles came back to the area and the sharks came back to the waters. So this provided an extra boost to the economy that helped to repay the subsidies that the government had to pay to local fishermen. Similar effects have also been seen closer to home. Near the Isle of Arran, which is up on the west coast of Scotland, trawlers would dredge the bottom of the ocean in order to catch fish, in order to catch scallops in particular. And this had a devastating impact on the habitats and the ecosystem of the ocean floor. And it had impacts on the numbers of crabs and lobsters and sponges that lived there. So they created no fishing zones around the Isle of Arran in 2008, where in some places there was no trawling whatsoever. In other places they only allowed sport fishing. And over the course of 10 years, they also found this had a massive impact on biodiversity. When scientists compared the number of species inside the no fishing zone compared to outside, they had a much greater range of species in the no fishing zones. They also noticed over the course of those 10 years that the biomass of sponges and the numbers of lobsters and crabs in those areas dramatically improved. Both of these examples help to highlight that if we give space for our ocean plants and animals to breed and feed and survive, then they are capable of replenishing. It's estimated that we should designate up to a third of the world's oceans as no fishing zones to help recover the fish stocks that are being depleted in the Atlantic and in the Pacific and all over the globe. So also check out the link that I've put on the Google Classroom as well. And that's another example of how whales can introduce what we call trophic cascade throughout the whole ecosystem of the ocean. Next week, we're going to be looking at ocean plastics and the research that has gone into estimating the amount of plastic in the oceans. Your weekend challenge today is to look at a particular type of food that you eat often. It could be some meat, it could be some fish, it could be some vegetables. I want you to try and find out where exactly that food has come from. See if you can find out the country of origin and the sorts of conditions that it might have come from. So if it's meat and fish, is it free range? Is it sustainably farmed? If it's vegetables, has it been flown in from a long distance? Because it's really important we understand that the choices we make as consumers have an environmental impact. So stay positive, have a good weekend, and I'll see you next time.